We are pleased to have with us Rabbi Avi Grossman, a Machon Shilo associate. I just express my own personal sentiment that it's very nice to have rabbis who are able to give us some clarity in a halachic world where sometimes it's difficult to get the type of clarity that we get here at Machon Shilo. Thank you, Rabbi Grossman.
Anytime. Thanks for hosting this. So we'll get right into it. First of all, I chose the topic tonight because of political developments back across the pond. I like to stress, and I'll stress this again at the end, halacha and politics do not mix. As a matter of fact, halacha and politics basically ruins everything. Politics should not mix with friendships, relationships, Torah, rabbinics. It's poisonous, and sometimes people get too carried away with politics, and sometimes it creates division among people who should not be divided. It's harmful to unity, especially Jewish unity, and sometimes people just take a side. Early in their life, we decide that we're on the left, we're on the right, and we are going to take that political side in any discussion because that's our team, and we'll stay with that for the rest of our lives. And sometimes it blinds us to truths, and it blinds us to friendships. It blinds us to perhaps the way we should be serving God. So I wanted to take an objective view of the halachot involved here. I'd also like to say, and also we'll touch this on this at the end, that this is a strictly American malady. The fact that this is such a political hot button issue. You look around the world, it's not such a thing. And even though there are people, let's say, unfortunately, here in Israel, we would say that perhaps there's too much abortion going on. It's just not the issue. It is in America or in Europe also. It's not, apparently it's not the issue. I'm not so much familiar with what goes on in Europe, let's say. And in the Western world, it's not an issue. For example, gun control. Here in Israel, people have guns, people don't have guns for whatever reason, but it's not the issue it is in America. And perhaps that's a problem that it is that. So let's get right into it. Let's look at the sources over here. This is a passage from Exodus. It talks about two men are fighting. They should not be fighting, but for whatever reason they are fighting. And they hit a woman. It says they collide with a woman who's pregnant, and they cause her to miscarry. Interestingly enough, Chazal's term for a miscarriage, here it says Yatseu Yeladeha, her children come out. In Mishnaic Hebrew, the word is lahapil, to drop. Lipol is the standard pa'al form, and lahapil is a hifil form. And even in modern Hebrew, there is no distinction necessarily in terms of the strict verbs used between a miscarriage and an abortion. They're used the same thing. Lahapil is to miscarry and to abort. And therefore in Hebrew, when you speak, you sometimes have to illustrate whether it's a spontaneous or a natural miscarriage or an intentional or one done by the hands of man. So that distinction is missing in Hebrew, whereas in English we do have that. So they cause a miscarriage here, and it says that the person who caused this should be punished, and he has to pay the husband of the woman a fine. And it also says that if there's an ason, that is a tragedy, what happened here, apparently the woman dies from this. She doesn't just miscarry, she actually dies. So it says you shall give a soul for a soul, or better yet, a life for a life. Sometimes in Korean they were translating sometimes nefesh as a person. That should be the proper translation. But here, maybe not. A person for a person, it means that because they've caused the death, they are treated as murderers over here. And then you have a classic pasuk over here, which Chazal always understood, and history has borne this out, that the Jews always consider this to be a statement about monetary damages, not literally an eye for an eye. But it's important here. But when it does say nefesh tachas nefesh, it does mean, ironically, that people are punished with the death penalty for causing death. This verse, or collection of verses, is discussed in Bava Kama, starting on Daf Memchet on Amud Bet. in the Mishnah there. It basically describes this case over here. And for brevity's sake, and also because we don't have time to get into that whole Gemara, I brought here how the Rambam, his summation of the relevant halachot. Here he says, "Hanogefet ha'isha," someone who hits, but it doesn't literally mean hit. Hit would be lehakot. It means he raises his hand on purpose. And this one more like he causes injury to a woman, not perhaps by bumping into her, etc. So it says, and she loses her children from it, even though he had no intention. That's an important one. See, even though he was not unintentional, he still has to pay the value of the vladot, the offspring, to her husband. See, it says here, it says Bal Isha, so it says Labal. Venezek v'tzar leisha, and he also has to pay for damages to and the pain to this woman. Remember the classic payments for hurting someone else: nezek, tsar, ripui, sheveth, bosheth, etc. And then he goes on and explains how we determine this amount that he has to pay. And then he gives the halacha what happens if this same incident, except she had died from it. Says even though he was shogeg, perhaps you would have thought that, okay, a person who kills bishogeg unwittingly when he wasn't supposed to. Usually, I think the proper translation in that case would be unintentionally or negligently. Normally people like that end up, for example, in Ir Miklat. That's their punishment. They have to stay in this city of refuge, and perhaps if they step foot, a close relative, court-appointed close relative of the victim, can actually kill them. That's the Goel Hadam. Here it says he's exempt. Ve'eno mishalem klum. He doesn't have to pay anything because it says ason in ve'lo ason anosh yanesh. Only if someone doesn't die, does he get a punishment. So you see here that he doesn't, basically because he's going to be punished with something worse. Because he's a killer. He's not going to have to give the payment. He says the verse doesn't make a distinction between whether he did this intentionally or unintentionally, because this involves a misas bastin, so he doesn't have to pay. And that's one more time. It says here, he's trying. He did bump into her or somehow cause her injury. There was a purposeful point here. And if it says here, what happens if he was trying to hurt the other guy, chavero? He's trying to hurt his chavero. It doesn't mean friend. It means his fellow Jew. And then he hurt the woman, even though she died. So because he didn't intend to kill her with this act of smiting. This case, there is no death penalty involved, so he should have to pay. He then gives the example of what happens if an ox causes the same thing. Ox, lavdafka, it could be any other animal that a person owns. It makes a similar distinction. I put the point over here, though, and this is a point made by many of those who are, I guess you could say, more lenient when you ask them the question, abortions in halacha under certain circumstances, permitted or not permitted. They show you that in all these cases from Bava Kama, the assumption is that the fetus is not a person for whom we consider charges of murder. See? The whole point is that if he killed someone, there's no question of whether or not a person pays. There's a general rule in the Talmud. A person in one act has incurred a penalty. He should be punished physically with his life, capital punishment. And he's also incurred what should be a monetary punishment or a monetary restitution. So we say, Kim lech midirabah minech. That means you give him the worst of those two. And more importantly, he's paying with his life, or potentially paying with his life. So he does not pay with his cash in that case. And in this case, we never consider that, well, the child is dead, so that should be a capital case. We only talk about if the woman died, if the woman didn't die. But we never talk about is the child dead. That's the assumption the child did die, or they even consider it a child. Yes, they use the word child here. Chazal used the word child. Over here, you can see the Torah used the word child, but the child is not in the equation. The only time we consider if this will be a capital case is if the woman died. And that is clear to most of the poskim. I haven't found someone who denies that this is the case necessarily. They just say, to what extent do we hold of this? I have something here I highly recommend, because we can't, ideally we should go through this entire thing right now, but we cannot. It's long, it's in Hebrew, Rav Tzuriel, who I have referred to as the Baal HaOtzerot, because that's the title of his Sfarim. He's the one who writes anything that has Otzerot Raya or Otzerot whatever. There's quite a few series. Rav Tzuriel, the former Mashgiach of Shalvim, and the Rav in Bnei Brak, who's mentored us. So he wrote a nice long summation of the various opinions from 20th century poskim and beforehand, who dealt with the question of abortion, and it was published in Techumen a few decades back, and it's a must-read for anybody who wants to be familiar with the sugya. Rav Tzuriel stresses that when we ask the question, abortion permitted by halacha, it's certainly not in consonance with, let's say, the right-wing pro-life lobby in the United States that wants to explicitly prohibit abortion. I don't even know if the pro-life groups allow for the cases that are explicitly allowed by Chazal, which we will see going forward. He writes here that the source for Rashi, that the fetus, that's an ubar, is not considered a nefesh, that is a person, no personhood. See, that's a good way to translate this, not just a soul. Says in Shemot there, a person strikes a man and he dies. If you'd read this verse, you'd say the person's only liable for, let's say, striking a man, a grown man. How do you know that the pasuk is also including the penalty for striking a woman or a child? And then the Talmud says, well, Talmud Lomar, kol nefesh adam, any human person. So it says, Rak katan shekvar yatzal avir olam nechshav lechol nefesh. So it says, only a person or someone who's come out into the world, he's been born, is considered kol nefesh. That's what you also find from the Bavli in Nida Memdalid. She'er adin tinok ben yomo harago chayav. A person, a Jewish person, kills even a one-day-old baby. That means the day he's born, so he's liable to the death penalty. The implication is that before the child is born, a person who somehow killed this fetus, because that's what a child is before he's born, is not liable to the death penalty. And they derive that from this very pasuk, ki kol nefesh mikol makom, any nefesh, but personally gets personhood, that he's considered a nefesh once he is born. So that is a very interesting idea. That there is this, already we see a few sources Talmudically, perhaps even from these very verses, that at least when we're dealing with Jewish people, personhood is only attained upon being born. This is not, by the way, a heter for a permission for committing abortions. It just shows that if someone causes, let's say here we cause an unwanted abortion over here, a person is certainly not going to be tried for what they call now Western law manslaughter, what I've called for shorthand of murder. The crime is not necessarily killing a person. Yes, I don't see any room here, and no one sees any room here for permissibility. It doesn't mean just because someone's going to pay. Well, perhaps if you were crazy, you would say, well, if a man and a woman, the parents agree to a nice cash payment, they're willing to let someone abort their fetus. Such a thing is not entertained. That would be terrible. For obvious reasons, we're going to see also later why Rambam would say such a thing is terrible. But you do see from here that personhood is not confirmed upon someone who has not yet been born. But there is a distinction. Here in Sanhedrin and Zayin Amud Bet, the Gemara discusses the various commandments that bind the rest of humanity, all of humanity except for the Jewish people, what Chazal call Bnei Noach, Noahides. Basically, Ben Noach is anybody who is not Jewish. Why Ben Noach? Because Noah is the latest progenitor of the entire human race. Apparently, the entire human race would have been wiped out except for Noah and his family, so they're the sole survivors. So everybody traces his lineage to Noah. And he was given 7 commandments. Really, the first one was given 6, the 7th was given to Noah. And that's how basically Gentiles, good Gentiles, should govern their societies and themselves forever. It says here that Ashkach Rabbi Yaakov Baracha Dawei Kathiv B'Sefer Agatha Devei Rav. Rabbi Yaakov Baracha found written in a book of Agadata, but still we're going to find halacha in the house of Rav. Here's the beginning of the quote: Ben Noach neherag b'dayan echad. A Ben Noach, that is a Gentile, can be put to death on the the discretion of a single judge. Why is that surprising? Sometimes judges in the Western world, I guess they decreed the death penalty, or they sentence someone to death. That's just one judge. Well, there's a jury. Sometimes there's no jury. The chidush of this, the novelty of this, is that in Jewish law you need a much larger court. You need 23 to sometimes try someone to give them lashes. You need variously 3, 5, an odd number of judges, but more than one. And sometimes you even have a court of 71. But for Gentiles, the standard is merely one judge. One judge is sufficient. Uv Edechad, also one witness. Gentile standard is only one witness. Jewish standards need 2 witnesses at least in a Jewish court when Jewish people are litigants, etc. And without a proper warning, Jews, as you know, in order to receive the penalties involved, whether it's a malkut, death, etc., they have to be warned by the witnesses beforehand. And mipi ish, v'lo mipi isha, but it still has to be a man testifying, not a woman. Va'afilu karov, and even if the witness is a relative, in the Jewish law, well, relatives' testimony is not admissible. Mishum Rabbi Shmuel amru af al ha'ubarim, and Rabbi Shmuel says they're also convicted for killing fetuses. That is the main line over here. And then they bring a pasuk, which actually talks about how Noah was directly told by God, "Wa'achet dimechem lafshotechem ed rosh miad kol chaya ed reshenu umiad ha'adam miad ish achiu ed rosh et nefesh ha'adam." This is basically the verse where God tells Noah that human life is precious, and God himself is going to hold people accountable, even animals accountable for killing another person. So people who kill people should be held accountable, so also animals. And it says here, someone who spills the blood of man should have his own blood spilled by man. That is, men are supposed to inflict the death penalty on others in order to preserve society. And unfortunately, in the Western world, this has been forgotten. Also in Israel, this has been forgotten. If you have murderous people, the only way to protect society from them is by putting them to death, letting clear murderers and violent criminals who are not recalcitrant and certainly do not regret their crimes. They're happy about what they did, need to be put to death in order for society to be able to function, and we've forgotten that. And this is derived from the verse. It says, Adam bi Adam, afalu barim. Here they're going to derive this, where I'm highlighting here. My tamei de Rabbi Shmuel, what's his reasoning? Dechtiv shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam dam yishafech. We normally read this as one who spills the blood of man should have his blood spilled by man. By man should his blood be spilled. But you could also read this as shofech dam ha'adam bi'adam. That's not the way the Trupp is, but that's the way he expounds this verse. So one who spills the blood of a man within a man. What man exists within a man? That's the question. Ezu adam shu badam, omer ze ubar shebimai imo. This is the fetus inside his mother's innards. Sometimes ma'ayim means intestines, but obviously we know that the fetus doesn't grow in the intestines, but rather in the womb. But that's not the point. The point is that this is the Talmudic precedent for the idea that Gentiles have a different standard. Gentiles are held accountable for committing abortions. It is an act of murder. Whereas for a Jew, the standard is different. And that has a lot of consequences. We're going to see that, well, one could say, even if I found a case where a Jew was bidden to perform an abortion, to save a mother's life, for example, that's the classic case we're going to see. Does a Gentile have a similar permission? And the answer, I would say, is yes. When we go see that, we'll give an argument for that. But the point is, certainly Gentiles cannot just elect to commit abortions. That is under the rubric of murder. Gentiles are not allowed to murder. They could defend. They sometimes have to defend themselves, and sometimes they have to give the death penalty. But you can't say that one is defending himself from a fetus, nor is the fetus guilty of anything that he deserves the death penalty. So when we are asked, how should a Gentile society function, we should, at least if we're proper Jews and we're familiar with this, and the Noahites want to function according to Halacha, they should know that, first of all, abortion is a crime for them. It is a murder. It should not be done so flippantly, so matter of factly. Remember, in America, they describe that political opinion as pro-choice. It's just a mere choice, which is perverse when you think about it. Once again, we're talking about a Gentile society. But like I said, there might be room for Gentiles to do this in order to save a mother's life, just like there's a dispensation for Jews explicitly. Here's where the Rambam actually brings us as a halacha. It's in the last treatise, Melachim and Milchamot, where he talks about Gentiles and their obligations to keep these commandments. He says, Ben Noach sharag nefesh afilu ubar b'meimo neragalav. A Noahide who kills a person, even if it's a fetus within his mother, he is killed for that. That is, he's given the death penalty for such a thing. And he gives other similar examples. This is important. If there's a rodef, case of rodef, someone trying to kill another person, so the Rambam previously described in the halachot of Rotzeach Shmirat Nefesh, regarding murder, bloodshed, and protecting oneself, there is this rule that one should try to protect others from a rodef, literally a pursuer, someone trying to kill another. So others are supposed to intervene and save that person who's called a nirdaf, the one who's being pursued. So when the Rambam says this, he's basically implying that the usual halachot apply to Gentiles also. Gentiles are bidden to save each other's lives and also are given the right to self-defense if someone's trying to kill them. But he says here, just like you have a Jew who technically decides to kill a pursuer can easily just trip the guy. I don't know, disarm the pursuer and neutralize the threat, but doesn't do so. Instead, chooses to kill that person. So that Jew would not be given the death penalty for doing that. Yes, that's a terrible way to kill someone, but technically speaking, that Jew is not given the death penalty. Whereas a Gentile who should have made this consideration, he could have easily stopped the pursuer using non-lethal means. So that Gentile is put to death for such a thing. A Jew is not. So this is a distinction. We always have to find distinctions between Jews and Gentiles. There's a Mishnah over here, which we're going into the major exception. But I guess because we might not get to it afterwards, there is an idea brought up by the Tosafists based on all this. And that is, there is a line in the Talmud that asks rhetorically, is there anything that is prohibited to a Gentile, but permitted to a Jew? The assumption is the Jews have more commandments. The Jews have more prohibitions. The Jews are supposed to be keeping a higher standard of Torah, and therefore, what is prohibited to a Gentile should certainly be prohibited to a Jew. If a Gentile is prohibited from aborting and it's considered an act of murder, just min hastam, without any other considerations, and that would be an act of murder. So of course it should be considered an act of murder for a Jew. And the Rambam in the Igeret Hashmad, and also you could see by his very rulings, doesn't hold of that idea. The Rambam gives many examples of Gentiles sometimes held to a higher standard than Jews. For example, anything regarding these penalties. A Gentile is killed for doing things that, if a Jew had done it, a Jew would not be killed. For example, thievery. A Jew who steals, whatever he steals surreptitiously or openly, with the difference between a ganav and a gazlan, a Jew is never put to death for theft except for kidnapping. Whereas a Gentile is, at least according to these rules, once he steals a shaveh pruta, the equivalent of a penny, or as it may be, or close to a penny, then the Gentile is to be put to death. So the argument that Tosfos brings is implicitly and explicitly denied by Maimonides, and maybe we don't hold of that Halacha. So just because a Gentile has this high standard, he's not allowed to perform an abortion or bring about the death of a fetus, it doesn't mean a Jew would be held to that standard. But we still haven't found the permission for a Jew. Here's the Mishnah Olot, the one that has the major exception, also brought Halacha. It says, Haishashi Makshalele. There's a woman who's having a really hard time giving birth. That is, the baby's just not coming out, and it's like basically killing her. You can imagine how dangerous these things were before the advent of modern medicine. Women dying in childbirth was not something unheard of, and we have to thank God that today things are much more different. So they basically have to perform an abortion. They're going to have to, unfortunately, cut up this child, dismember the child and kill him, and then take him out piece by piece. And that's what they say here. And that is basically going to save her life. It's going to terminate the pregnancy right at its end, but better to save the life of the mother. And the Chazal say, "Mipnei shechaya kodmin l'chayav." Her life takes precedence over his. Yatsa rubo. Well, once most of the baby has been born, though, and it's still whatever, the birth is not finishing and it's killing the mother, we don't touch him. She'ein dochi nefesh mipnei nefesh. One person's not more than another. They're basically having a tug of war here. We don't know who to kill. They're both considered persons. Why? Because this baby is born. This, by the way, is talking about among Jews, and that's the way the Rambam brings it in Rotzeach U'Shmirat HaNefesh. Rambam talks about right at the beginning of that treatise in the first chapter. He talks about having to save one's life from a rodef, a pursuer. And one has to try to do whatever he can to save that person's life. And then once he gives those halachot, he says, "Harezo mitzvat lo taseh shelo lachus al nefesh harodef." There's a negative commandment not to take pity on the life of this pursuer. He doesn't deserve any compassion because he's trying to kill someone. And then the Rambam concludes, "Lefichach horu chachamim sho ha ubera she maksha leiled." The sages taught us that if you have this pregnant woman and she's having a hard time giving birth, and so it's permissible to cut up the fetus, and whether you do it by hand or by some sort of concoction. There was an oral way to do it. Apparently, that's something I've heard about different poisons they used to have. So that's what you have to do. Notice he says mutter. Some say it's even a mitzvah necessarily. You have to save the woman's life because he is like a rodef trying to kill his mother. There's a long machloket. Rav Tzuriel brought a lot of the sources. I think it's once again it's worth seeing inside all the different answers to this question. Why Rambam resorted to actually saying a rodef over here in the Mishnah doesn't say that. It's apparent. Maybe we could have just said that before he's born, he's not a person, so we kill the baby in order to save this woman's life. Why did Rambam have to make this a case of rodef? Everybody has. Rav Tzuriel brings 12 different answers brought by poskim from the last few hundred years to answer this question, starting with Rabbi Akiva Eger, who was the first one, at least, to put it down into writing and then address it. So he's like a rodef, but then again, if this baby's born, he says once he takes out his head, that's not just rubo, it could be rosho or rubo, then we don't touch him because we don't know who's posing a bigger threat to the other. So we have here, I'm going to give a summation. I wrote this down for the benefit of those at home because now is a good time to actually get to this. We see from here that Gentiles punished with death for killing a fetus, whereas a Jew is not. And one might have inferred that a Jew is perhaps even permitted to do such a thing. Kamash Malan, over here, we have to have a justification. Here the Rambam says, saying terrible, basically describing an abortion, performing an abortion, but that's because we're trying to save the mother's life. There are those who then say, aha, so the only time a Jew would be permitted to willingly perform an abortion is in order to save the mother's life. And that is, we're going to see there are quite a few who say that. From the context, we see that Maimonides assumes that the aborting is prohibited even to Jews because of form of bloodshed min hastam. How do they know this? Because Rambam talks about this permitted form of abortion. He puts it right in there, the halachot of rotzeach and shmirat nefesh. He talks about a rodef. He talks about someone trying to murder someone else and how we're trying to protect them. In the context, it seems to say that the act of abortion, even according to Maimonides, at least the way he understood it, is an act of murder even for a Jew. Even if a Jew were to commit it without justification and not get the death penalty. Not every act of murder is one that deserves a death penalty. And the Rambam brings a few examples of that in the subsequent halachot. For the next few chapters, he describes someone who brings about someone else's death, either indirectly, paying someone else, etc. Those people, technically speaking, are not given the death penalty. But then again, Rambam, Maimonides, then goes and says that if you have people who are murderous, type of people who are always hiring others to kill, or people who are bringing about other people's deaths, and getting off from the halachically prescribed death penalties on technicalities, then the Beit Din or the king is actually supposed to intervene and still put these people to death extrajudicially. That is, if they're killing and they're getting off on technicalities, so they are given a technical death penalty, an unofficial death penalty. And you could say And I believe that this would be, for example, fit with the argument made by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was very much opposed to the heterim that others argued for back in the 20th century. You could say that a person who does commit abortion, according to the Rambam, if abortion is just as bad as bringing about someone else's death, then if you had, let's say, an abortionist, so the sages, the Beit Din, the king is supposed to intervene and put such a person to death, just like you'd put to death mobsters and other violent criminals who pose a threat to society. But that's not unanimous. And none of this touches, by the way, on the separate question of when life becomes life. And the difference between nefesh and neshama, there is quite a lot of Talmudic literature. When does life begin? I think from my background in biology, the way we understand it is life never ends. All living cells are just born from other living cells. The only question is, when does a person become something that is not his mother and his father? As you know, quick lesson in birds and the bees, the way people and most animals, at least the large animals, sexually reproduce involve sex cells from the parents combining into a new organism. But those sex cells themselves are alive to a certain point. Technically speaking, they're never dead. So life never ends. The only question is, when do we have a new person begin? And the Gemara and the sages have quite a few examples of, let's say, a person being born, a person becoming a separate entity 40 days in, and various other standards. It's a very tricky thing. But those are theological and philosophical questions and less practical ones. When, for example, we saw that first case in the Gemara where it talks about penalizing this man for causing this woman to miscarry, they didn't give a standard necessarily. Sometimes they rely on the Talmudic standard. A woman is considered halakhically pregnant once people notice that she's pregnant. Remember, they didn't have pregnancy tests back in the day. They didn't have urine tests, blood tests, or ultrasound. So they knew women were pregnant. Apparently, yeah, she missed her period, but sometimes that was not necessarily that she's pregnant. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe she wasn't keeping track enough. They say 40 days, hukra ubira. Now you could actually see she's showing, as we say in English. So this is something that it seems that penalty would have been inflicted on whether on a Jew for this monetary penalty for causing a miscarriage, or a Gentile for aborting a fetus, basically comes into play once we have made the determination that she is pregnant. But if we've made an earlier determination, perhaps even earlier, there's some say no, 40 days is the standard. Let's move on here. Here's the Tosfos here on that I mentioned before. This is on page 59 of Sanhedrin, where they bring this argument. Is there anything that is more lenient for a Jew that a Gentile has? And like we said, it actually depends. Maimonides doesn't actually hold of that. Here we have more Rav Tzuriel again, thank God. And he says that there's some who look for a number of opinions was a source for prohibition of killing a fetus, because it doesn't actually say thou shalt not kill a fetus or thou shalt not cause an abortion. So he brings a few of them. I recommend you go see them. The last Talmudic precedent is one that's very interesting, an intentional abortion. And that is mentioned in Arachin. Arachin, right there at the beginning, it's at the end of the first parak. A lot of people don't study Arachin. It's considered one of the harder Masechtot. Thank God for Daf Yomi, so we get to see all of these. This is the 7th page. And it talks about the one time where we actually go about intentionally making an abortion. And that is, a woman is being taken out to be killed. Why? She has committed a capital crime. The Beis Din has ruled that she worshipped idols or something else of that nature. So she is to be stoned or whatever it may be. Usually the typical example in Sanhedrin is stoning. So this woman's being taken out to the place of execution. It says we'll wait for her to give birth. She could say, wait, hold on. In my 9th month, give me a few more days to give birth. At least the child should live. No, we don't. Just like the Gemara and the sages were very much opposed to halanat hadin, that is delaying the death penalty. Once someone is given the death penalty, we are to inflict it basically that very day, or they're supposed to take a day off to make sure before they take the final vote. But afterwards, they do it pretty quickly. They take him out slowly and see if anybody has any perhaps any testimony or proof otherwise. But we kill him or her right away. But once she goes into labor, that means she's literally sitting on the birth stool, or what you and I call labor, then we allow her to give birth. Why? Because apparently now the child is its own person. And also, if a woman's killed, they can technically get hana'ah, benefit from her hair. Okay. The Gemara assumes that this is obvious, of course. Gufahi. Why would we wait? To kill her? It's just the fetus is just part of her. Okay, Gufahi. And the fact that they threw in this explanation over here is a machlokas where Moshe finds in others. What is this trying to teach us? It's no, it's necessary for them to tell us this. Wait a minute. Like we saw in Bava Kama. If a man caused the miscarriage, so he has to be paying back the husband some damages for the lost child, because he would have said, there's a payment involved to the husband. He's also involved in this. It's mamona devalhu. The fetus is actually the property, mamona, or the liability of the husband, to the extent that he could charge someone, he could demand some payment for the damage to this entity. Because the husband could do such a thing, we would have said, you know what? Let the woman give birth, because the husband still has an interest in this. Notice it doesn't say, let the child give birth to give him a chance. No, the child that we assume doesn't have his own personhood. The only question is, from the side of the mother, the child is going to be given the death penalty because he's part of his mother. But from the side of the father has an interest, so perhaps we shouldn't let the father lose his interest. He should not lose his interest. Kamash Malan, therefore, the Mishnah told us, no, the woman's pregnant. She has been convicted of a capital crime. She is to be put to death and not given the chance to give birth unless she's already in labor. And they ask Akashi over here also, but we want to get to this part over here. They conclude here that Rav Yehuda says, Kevin Docker Gufa my time. What's the reason? Why would we suddenly give her a chance to give birth once she goes into labor? And they say because now Gufa Achrina, giving birth, there's a disconnection. And by the way, sometimes the placenta finally separates from the wall of the womb, and that's what causes sometimes the child to want to give birth. That's why the body starts to go into labor. It has to eject the child. He's technically not connected to the mother. The umbilical cord is connected to a placenta that's not connected to the mother. So now you see he's giving birth. He's no longer connected. Whatever happened, he's no longer connected to his mother. Now he's just trying to get out. Amrav Yudom Shmuel Haisha Yotza Ale Areg Makinota Keneged Beit Hirayon Kedei Shigamut Havlad Tchila Kedei Shalo Tavo Lidei Niwul. Wow, harsh halacha over here. Read this slowly. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says that if a woman is being taken out to be executed, not only do we not wait for her, like the Mishnah says, we don't wait for her to give birth, we actually hit her against her womb. Okay? They hit her. This is the way they used to perform abortions, by the way. They don't the primitive way. They just keep hitting her there so that the child dies first, so that she not come to some disgrace after she's killed. If we would, let's say, inflict the death penalty on her as being fully pregnant, that could cause a spontaneous labor, and then the child will come out. Child will probably be dead, but still, whatever they do is get signaled. We don't want to get into the death penalty now. And that would be considered a disgrace that this woman is basically, let's say, stoned, decapitated, whatever it may be. And also she's giving birth there. It's kind of messy. That would disgrace that she doesn't deserve. Yes, she deserves the death penalties, but she doesn't deserve to be embarrassed like this. And they ask another kasha over here, and they make this distinction. What's this distinction? There is that... how do you know that the child is going to die first? If you do this, we have a Talmudic precedent over here that sometimes it's the child that dies first, it's the mother that dies first, and the child dies secondly. So they say here, Ani mili legabe mita b'derech hateva. I added those words. When a woman dies naturally, ID devlad zutrach yusa eile tipa debalchamavet mechatech la simanim. If you have a woman die naturally, so the malchamavis, whatever, causing her to die, kills the child first. Aval nerga he made the barisha. If someone goes and kills a woman, whatever way the Beit Din would kill the person, there's 4 different ways they do it, that would cause the mother to die before the child. And therefore, if you're going to execute her, you have to kill the child first. So this is, like I said, perhaps we should have put an R rating on the shir beforehand, but sometimes we have to discuss these things because it's Torah, and this is what the sages said. So this is the precedent for when we actually do perform an abortion, where apparently they do it l'chatchila. And what do you get from this? Well, once again, there's no personhood for the woman, and they've even made the argument. This is Tzitz Eliezer, based on other poskim who preceded him for many centuries, that to save the woman, one more time, you're saving the woman from almost a certain disgrace. So because it's her body that's doing this, it's part of her, gufahi, part of her body that's doing this disgraceful thing to her. It's not a person. So we bring about an abortion. Now, some would say you can't learn anything from this case about performing abortions because, in this case, this woman is already convicted. She has been sentenced to death. And the rule is once someone or even an animal is sentenced to death, they're considered already like the walking dead. They don't count anymore, and the child is also there. So, in this case, they're both going to die. What does it matter? We're committing abortion. But it doesn't mean that we could then make the jump and say that if you have some woman who wants to protect herself for whatever reason, she could then choose to abort her fetus. But there is those who say it. I don't know. I think this Gemara can go both ways, but you can certainly see why this would be used as a precedent for those who are more permissive. Let's see what Rav Tzuriel said over here. If we're talking about a biblical prohibition, by the way, abortion, a biblical prohibition, and it was talking about one of murder, the biblical prohibition of murder, which is the most grave sin one commit, whether Jew or Gentile. Murder, by the way, is more grave than the other big two, Gilui Arayot, various forbidden relations, and Avodah Zarah, idolatry, simply because it is much more destructive to society, both Jew and Gentile. It is the number one sin a person commits. Lo haya nivula shel isha yotzeit le'areg adif al chayehu ubar. If we were talking about a biblical prohibition, especially one of murder, the fact that this woman's going to get a little disgraced, like it's going to be unseemly that you see this woman spontaneously eject the fetus once she's been given the death penalty, that wouldn't be a consideration over the life of this fetus. But we see it is. And therefore, Rav Tzuriel gives the argument that they had others. There's no necessarily biblical prohibition. Rav Shechter disagrees, by the way. Rav Shechter says, based on that Gemara we saw, the first one, saying that it is a biblical prohibition to cause someone's death. It's just not the same as shfichut damim. The fetus is death. And he says we hold that way. It is a biblical prohibition. Okay, so that's a machloket there. And the Gemara continues over there. This is something strange. Here, you looked at this Gemara over here in Arachin, and you see that the Gemara basically denies the personhood of this child. Why? Because his mother, he's still in the womb. He's still in utero, and he's part of his mother, and he's going to be killed along with his mother. The only question is, how do you go about doing it? So you make sure he goes first, and that's to avoid a disgrace to the mother. Yet the Gemara then continues. The very next line says that if you have a woman who is not convicted to death, she goes into labor and dies on Shabbos for whatever reason. That's a tragedy. We try to bring a knife and perform an emergency C-section on this dead woman to extract the child. So wait, that's pikuach nefesh, and says here you could even violate Shabbos technically. Why? There's no knife around. So carry a knife through the public domain in order to save the potential life of this child. Even of a suffix. So pikuach nefesh, a person's threat to life. That's when we desecrate the Sabbath in order to save a life. So in this case also, it's a suffix. Even if a suffix, we save a life. So the Gemara here is almost contradictory. Here on top, over here, just right at the beginning of the Gemara. This is almost how the parak ends, by the way. Right at the beginning, the Gemara basically denies personhood to this child. But then, once the mother's out of the question, she's dead, and it's talking about a different case. Oh, we could save a life, violate Shabbos because this ubar has a chance to life. And indeed, it's happened. There's people who've survived this. The mother dies, but the child survived. And as a matter of fact, this is Maimonides' assumption. Maimonides assumed that the only time they did C-sections was this way. The Gemara in Bechorot talks about C-sections on animals, behemot, and on people. And Rambam doesn't modify the case of C-sectioning, let's say, a cow. Presumably they would survive. Nowadays, it does happen. They do C-sections on farm animals, for example. And nowadays, thank God, many women have survived C-sections multiple times, and it's almost a daily occurrence. But the Rambam there in the Pirush Mishnayot assumes that there's no such thing. He heard reports fantastic reports of women surviving C-sections, but he never saw such a thing, and he cannot believe such a thing. So you have to thank God. The Rambam was considered a top doctor back in the day. Thank God things are much safer. So this is the usual case. A C-section is performed on a woman who's basically dead. So this Gemara itself is a little bit, once again, you could go both ways, but you could see why some posakim would give a heter in this case. The major posek of the 20th century who was quite permissive allowing abortions was the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who was a Dayan. He passed away early this century. He was also the posek for Shaarei Tzedek, major hospital in Jerusalem. So he had to deal with these things all the time. And basically, it was his teshuvot that got the attention of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was a great posek who lived the last part of his life, the major part of his life in New York, and was basically the foremost halachic influence on the American rabbinate, at least in the 20th century. Rabbi Soloveitchik tried to stay out of halacha. He was related to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, by the way, and his talmidim certainly wanted to know what his halachic positions were, but Rabbi Soloveitchik tried to stay out of the psak realm. He didn't write any tshuvot, for example. He didn't write any sifrei halacha. That wasn't his style. But Moshe Feinstein, the Rosh Yeshiva, was pretty much always asked these complicated questions and wrote well-known volumes of teshuvot, responsa regarding halacha, and he took a much stricter opinion on these matters. And so the question came up of aborting mamzerim, etc. There are many arguments pro and con. Aborting a mamzer. The Gemara assumes that a mamzer, that's the type of sin that leads to something that cannot be fixed. The person committed this sin. Now there's mamzer muwat luchal litkon, unfixable sin because there's a permanent stain on reality now that produced a mamzer. So the question was aborting a mamzer. Now, okay, we can see pro and con. Rabbi Soloveitchik's position, by the way, was a little bit more lenient than Rav Moshe Feinstein's because he seems to follow what the Tzitz Eliezer says on this one. Also, Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli wrote. You can find the sources there. Maybe we'll post it afterwards. I give a link also to Rav Tzuriel's encyclopedic article there from Tchumen, which is very important. So he was asked about a Tay-Sachs baby, and Rav Tendler, for example, follows Rav Moshe Feinstein's logic. Rav Tendler was very much against aborting children that we have made the exact determination that they are going to suffer a debilitating disease and probably die very young and suffer most of their short, unfortunate lives. So Rav Soloveitchik said they gave a heter, well-known heter. Rav Luckstein wrote about this. He was the one to whom Rabbi Soloveitchik told this explicitly, and this has been in writing, a well-known position that Rabbi Soloveitchik took, that one could abort a Tay-Sachs baby. And that's a common Tay-Sachs is a debilitating neurodegenerative disease that affects disproportionately affects Ashkenazic Jews, his community itself. There were other genetic diseases also that were quite prominent back then. So he said that, he gave a heter for such a thing. Rav Tendler, like I said, disagreed with this. The Tzitz Eliezer, once again, he took all the lenient, he was able to make a lenient argument from all these, and he basically permitted an abortion based on this Gemara and others in Arachin, where I'm pointing right now, scrolling with the mouse. So the Tzitz Eliezer felt that a woman could abort her baby if it was for the sake of her own health, for whatever it may be. And that's, I wouldn't say a right. Halacha doesn't talk about rights, but that is certainly her prerogative. She could do such a thing if she needed to, especially kal v'chomer to save her life or to save her health. And Rav Tzuriel actually begins and ends his article with this, saying that apparently the majority of poskim did take lenient, nuanced views with regards to the abortion question, especially with regards to unwanted pregnancies due to mamzerut or rape, or just because there's a disease that would affect either the mother or the child. And he concludes over here, I'll read it. Sometimes it's best to take the approach, the lenient opinion or the permissive opinion is preferable. That's in Beitza. Better that we hear the power of one who permits. He's confident. He's not afraid to permit. It's very easy to always say, just be machmir, don't. But if a person has a confidence, koach de tera adif. The fact that someone can be prohibit, that's no proof to anything. Anybody can be machmir all they want. And he says over here, we've seen throughout this article, so that there are those who, whoever has let's say, a prohibitive argument, there is an answer to that. I like to say that nuance, or Salvation was described himself as a master of nuance. I've also seen Rabbi Yuder, with whom I was speaking to a few years ago. You could look at it, Rabbi Alan Yuder. I have a video with him on YouTube. He is, ironically, a Talmud of Rav Tendler, and also a former conservative Rav. And he left the conservative movement for obvious reasons, because they basically gave up on halacha. And he went back into the Orthodox rabbinate. He got smicha from the chief rabbi here in Israel, and Rav Tendler, of course, and then eventually went to the Orthodox rabbinate. His son is a younger scholar of note. And he gets offended by those who just want to say that it's prohibited because it's prohibited. He thinks that they're giving themselves too much authority. So you have to watch out people who lack nuance, learning from people who lack nuance, or a sense of humor for that matter, or a knowledge of Hebrew grammar. All these things indicate an ability to be able to accurately go through the sources and come to an opinion that takes everything into account. But the Americanist opinions, we could say they don't really jive with halacha. This whole, abortion on demand thing, or just get rid of all of it, is totally lacks nuance. It's all black and white. There's no gray areas there. And if you live in a Noahide culture, it just goes to show you that if they're basically going to adopt, or if they have Roe versus Wade as it existed in America, if that was the law of the land, that's not something that Americans should be happy with. That's certainly not what Noahides are bidden to do. But then again, if they just prohibit it, then Jews and others, when they have actually a permitted instance, let's take the most extreme one that everybody agrees to, the one Maimonides described, that woman who is having a difficult labor might even die from it. Would, let's say, the law in Texas or someplace else allow the Jews to perform abortions when their poskim allow them? That's a danger. Even in Israel, we hope that the laws reflect the halacha as it pertains to both Jews and Gentiles. The Gentiles should have their halachot, and the Jews should have theirs. With regards to Torah Eretz Yisrael, which we always should mention, I do not know what Rabbi Bar-Hayim's opinion on this matter is. I've never heard from him explicitly. I'm also not a spokesman, so I cannot speak for him, and perhaps we would hear his opinion. I don't know what the Vilna Gaon had to say on this issue. I haven't found any Rishalmi against the Bavli type of thing. Sometimes, the Rishalmi is more permissive and the Bavli is more machmir, or vice versa. I don't think anything like that exists. I haven't seen sources where necessarily they're bringing one more Eretz Yisrael sources. However, today, you do know that Moshe Feinstein lived in New York, and the more machmir types still are in Chutz La'aretz, whereas the Tzitz Eliezer and Rav Avad Yosef did live in Israel. They lived in Jerusalem, and they were more permissive. But then again, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was apparently more machmir. And he gave people, you want to be, Rav Schechter has a story there. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach told people about the Tzitz Eliezer's more permissive opinions because he didn't want to tell them his own. He knew that they were looking for something permissive, so he relied on that of the Tzitz Eliezer. And there's also little of practical precedent. But here's the thing: the argument from silence. In the olden days, the reason that this doesn't come up, by the way, let's think about this. You're not going to find this question explicitly. Is it okay to abort a fetus? Is it permissible by halacha because of mamzei root, or pain to the mother? The child is going to have a disease. Is there such a prohibition? So the first question is an argument, actually. See? Avoid mamzei root. You could give arguments both ways. The second is intriguing because pain to the mother, that's basically where you have the permission come in. That's what the Matirim say. And the third would have been impossible because we don't know if a child had diseases before. Before, basically, you didn't know. Nowadays, we know the child's going to be a boy or girl even before it's born, although somehow in the Western world, even when a child's born, they deny that it's a boy or girl. I don't know why. That's insanity. But that couldn't have been a question back in the day. But then again, what we call safe abortions are basically a miracle of the modern era. In the olden days, this question couldn't come up. They could have asked Rambam, can we perform an abortion on a woman in order to prevent mamzerut, in order to prevent a diseased child from being born with and dying right then and there, in order to protect the mother from something that's going to happen in a few months. There was no such thing. Rambam entertains abortions when the woman's basically dying in pregnancy or being taken out to be executed. There was no such way that you could safely, even though people have been trying this for years, people are looking for this holy grail, first of birth control. The problem is people want all the pleasure of these activities, but they don't want the consequences. They don't want They don't want children. They don't want disease. They don't want emotional attachment. But the problem is the Torah told us that God wants us to multiply and He wants us to do it the right way. And God gave us these prohibited relations, Jew and Gentile alike, to understand that there are consequences to these things. But we've been trying to escape these consequences. And the idea of abortions is a very new thing. In the olden days, how would they do it? Like the Gemara says, you want this woman to abort her child. Basically, they thought of extreme violence to this woman and her abdomen, and hopefully that will cause the baby to come out. But you could very well kill the woman in that case. And other primitive forms of attempted abortions involved poisoning the woman. And even until nowadays, they've been trying to look for this miracle pill, an abortion pill, or some plan B, things like that. Even nowadays, taking such things cause women to be deathly ill. It's not something that people should be doing. So this question wasn't something that was relevant until the advent of modern medicine, because there was no real safe, reliable way, at least safe to the woman, for abortion. So it was basically out of the question. And perhaps Maimonides would agree to this line that they say, "Heter chavala tikun haguf." That's I guess how you could summarize the Tzitz Eliezer's lenient position. It is permissible to cause a chavala. Chavala is wounding someone. We've seen here that a woman can allow herself to be wounded. Remember, basically the fetus is just part of her. It's not a separate living being, as can be seen from those Gemarot. So tikkun haguf, in order to get a much better benefit for her body, she could cause a chabalah. She could wound this other part of her body. Maimonides might even agree to that, because now it's possible. And once again, it's assuming that the prohibition is to wound the body. That's the only thing that's wrong with terminating the pregnancy, and that there's actually some benefit available to the woman. So this opens up a Pandora's box that used to be inconceivable back in the olden days. So someone asked me before, my own opinion, I don't know. I thank God I'm not asked these types of questions, and don't want to be the type of person to be thrown into this kind of situation. There's this other idea, property, liability, and entitlement. You could have said, well, the woman could decide, it's her body, her choice, let's say, or she's going to be given the restitution. Maimonides says, don't go down that path and say, well, because a person could say, you know what, I'd rather be paid. A person does he have the right, let's say, to become a guinea pig? People who go to the pharmaceutical companies, they need people on whom to conduct these trials. So they give them money to make it worth it for these people to take all sorts of medicines, or perhaps, recently we talked about the whole China virus thing. Those people volunteered to be the first ones to be vaccinated, and then they decide, we need a lot more guinea pigs, so we're just going to mandate that all populations have to be vaccinated. That's a dangerous thing. Does a person have the right to do such a thing to himself? So I think an analogous case is the one the Rambam describes, why it is the Torah says that a man should not cause his daughter to go into prostitution. You would have said that, well, when a girl is chas v'shalom raped or seduced, and then the guy doesn't want to marry her, well, sometimes he's forced to, but the rapist and the seducer are bidden to pay a fine, a hefty fine, to the father of the young lady. And Rambam says, some people could have made the erroneous conclusion that because this woman's chastity is a liability on the father, that is, the father is paid if someone ruins it. So the father could say, well, it's my right. You know what? I could actually sell my daughter's purity here and to the highest bidder or something like that. Rambam says, no, it's strictly prohibited to do such a terrible thing. He writes this in the Sefer HaMitzvot and in the Mishnah Torah. He writes in both Hebrew and Arabic, so you should not get mistaken here. Even though, the fetus is considered part of the woman, apparently from these Gemarot, and it's the man's property, the father is to be restituted. If something were to happen to that fetus, it doesn't mean that you know what, for the right price, the parents can decide to end the pregnancy. Now we'll address some side points. Um, but first, I think that Rav Tzuriel's conclusion is good enough. There certainly are those on whom one can rely. There are the lenient positions. Just say that the Torah is in consonance with, let's say, the American so-called pro-life position is laughable, and the person shouldn't do that. We shouldn't just take sides. Jews should not be lockstep with any Israeli political party, kal v'chomer, any American or foreign political party. That's not our way, and we try to stay away from these things. Someone asked a good question. In America, we talk about rights. You know that they have right now. This thing hasn't been overturned. People have abortion on demand. So we're scandalized by that. We say, "Oh, that's murder," especially for Gentiles. That shouldn't be. But why are we not scandalized by their constitutional right to worship idols? Freedom of religion says that Gentiles, for all they want, can build themselves a temple of the Baal, and even to Molech, as long as they're not committing child sacrifice. But then again, uh, olden days they would have stopped such a thing because it involves killing the children, perhaps. But nowadays, child sacrifice in various forms seems to be the in vogue in America. But at least, let's say, clean idol worship. They have the right to do such a thing, and also to fornicate. All sorts of forbidden relations are not stopped. We basically let people do whatever they want. And why, as Jews, are we not scandalized with such things? Some people could say, yes, I would rather see, let's say, a foreign country, people intend to be Noahides, they should actually have prohibitions. There's no constitutional right to religion and no constitutional right to, I don't know, whatever people choose to do in their private lives. But there is an answer to this. As Jewish people, or as good Noahides, we should be more scandalized by abortion on demand than we are scandalized by the fact that people have the right to worship idols or to engage in the worst forbidden relations. And that is something I mentioned before. Uh, with regards to worshiping idols, that's what society has been doing forever. As the Rambam says, Tino Kot Shenishbu. Most societies, already it's ingrained in them, and that's just what they do. And we hope that they'll get better, and we hope that they'll achieve the ideal state. But for now, we can't really hold it against them so much. Not only that, these two sins, they don't cause so much societal destruction as does bloodshed. Bloodshed, like Rambam emphasizes, is in all cases something that we have to put a stop to which we have to put a stop. And because, at least for Gentiles, abortion, min hastam, is a form of murder, that should also be stopped. That should be stopped first to make sure that people aren't killing each other. And then we could work on an ideal Gentile society, teaching about morality and proper theology. But abortion has to end first, at least for the Gentiles. And perhaps someone should also leave society. Rambam says, you live in a society that's crazy. Go become a hermit, leave. Certainly one should try to find, if one lives in any place, a Gentile society, you should try to find one where they approach being proper Noahides. And as Jews, we have to make sure that our Jewish society here in the land of Israel becomes one that it keeps halacha, at least to the best that we can. And that brings us to a conclusion, at least for this week. You see there's a trailer for next week. But if there's any questions now's the time to ask them. Binyamin, do we have questions coming from the chat?
Yeah, well, we actually, in the chat, somebody by the name of P.O. asks, did it ever happen that a Jewish pregnant woman was condemned to death by the Beth Din?
That's a good question. We have very little historical accounts of Batei Din inflicting the death penalty. In our editions of the Gemara, it says a Beit Din that gave the death penalty once in 70 years was considered murderous. Rambam has once every 7 years. So it's not as exaggerated as you'd have from that plain reading of the Gemara. But we have very few people in Jewish history been put to death. One of the things that they started doing already in classical times, this is Second Temple times, is the sages sought all sorts of technicalities to avoid giving the death penalty to people except for murder. So, in fact, let's say Sabbath violation and idolatry, those are things for which the death penalty is prescribed. So what would someone do? They'd find all sorts of technicalities. They didn't want to give someone the death penalty. Also, adultery. We were not punishing adulterers with the death penalty for whatever reason. better to avoid that. So there's very little evidence of this type of thing. I think I used to tell people that you could count on one hand people mentioned in history were actually executed by a Jewish court. You have the Machon Shilo and you have the Megadef. Those are both in the Torah. The person who blasphemed and the guy who was collecting sticks. Apparently, one's in Vayikra, one's in Bamidbar, and you have Achan. But those were considered Horat Shah. Achan was took from the spoils of Jericho, and that was not necessarily something that for which he should have been killed. And you have another handful. You have perhaps an exaggerated story of Shimon and Shetach in Maccabean times, and it's even a question if Jebus was put to death by Jews, and you have Eichmann, and he wasn't even a Jew. So there's no actual recorded evidence of a Jewish woman being taken out to be killed and having this abortion performed on her. Don't forget the ones who mentioned this, by the way. It's Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Shmuel. Shmuel lived in the 3rd century. Oh wait, perhaps in the 2nd century. When was he born? He was a contemporary of Rabbi Yehuda, a younger contemporary. So I have to check exactly. If Shmuel's around in the late 2nd century, this is well after Jews were giving the death penalty that's described here. So he's not describing something that he could have seen. It was almost 200 years after we would have stopped doing such a thing. So even if it's a halacha, I don't know if it was ever actually put into practice. And I'd like someone could show me, enlighten me, any record of Jews, a proper Jewish court inflicting the death penalty. That'd be something I'd like to see because there's very little evidence thereof. Any other questions there?
There's another question in the chat from Daniel Weinstein. Okay. Can mental health of the Jewish woman be included in this discussion as is physical health?
Yes. So there are poskim who do that. They talk about severe mental health. Nowadays, we understand mental health a lot better. This comes up all the time now, unfortunately. Go listen to Rav Schechter's shir back in January. He gives I heard this a few times. He mentioned how there was a case of a young woman who basically needed abortion or she would have gone into a mental breakdown. Comes from a family that just couldn't handle what would happen, so they wanted to abort early on in order to save her basically a lifetime of trauma. So yeah, there is the Tzitz Eliezer certainly allows for such a thing, and of course there are those who vehemently disagree.
There's another question from Elizabeth Flores. Do we live by what is written in the Torah of, in our land, one law for all, both the citizen and the stranger? And so with this topic, live by one law for all in Israel.
So there actually is, the Rambam talks about making one law. The one law is the Torah, but the Torah has different standards. And the Rambam brings, based on the Gemara and Sanhedrin, that Gentiles in their own countries are supposed to have their own courts where they function according to Torah law for Gentiles. And the Jews are supposed to make courts for the Gerei Toshav. Those Ger Toshav means people who come to live in Jewish society who are not Jewish and do not convert to Judaism. And they're supposed to have their own system of law. But by system, I mean own system of enforcement and jurisprudence and the jurisdiction thereof, but not necessarily, the foundational text. The foundational text is the Torah as understood by our prophets and sages. But they subscribe to that, but they have their own judges and their own ways of going about these things as long as it fits the Torah. So it depends on how you formulate that. We're all supposed to follow the Torah, but the Torah prescribes different things for different communities. And there's the Gentile community beyond the land of Israel. And there's the Gentile community within the land of Israel. So that's sufficient answer.
Did anybody want to, any of the questioners want to follow up their question with another question? If yes, you can either say it or write it in the chat.
Hi, Rabbi. Danny, this is Danny Weinstein. It's a good to learn at your feet. I had a question came into my mind. If God willing, we'll return to halachic Judaism as the law in Eretz Yisrael. If that were to occur, what do you think the opinion would be if a woman were going to be put to death, but it was determined that based on her period and in her pregnancy, the fetus were viable? Would this halacha still apply, or would there would, if there was an opportunity to safely deliver the child before the execution, would that in any way change based on modern science?
I don't know. The good thing, like Rav Kapach points out, is the Torah Sheba'al Peh is alive. If we have a functioning Sanhedrin, they can re-examine the halachot. So a Sanhedrin could do many things. But I think at least if we're using the Mishnah as a basis for this, and they still follow the Mishnah makes a clear distinction. The Mishnah only says we wait for her to give birth once she's actually giving in labor, and that implies that even if she looks like she should give birth tomorrow, even or later today, but she's not in labor, so we don't wait. We put her to death right away. So I don't know if there's any new consideration that would bring about a lenience. I don't know. I haven't seen one. A leniency. Sorry. I hope that there would be. Some of us, I don't know. I perhaps there were Tanaim who disagree with this halacha before it was ruled, but we don't see any Tanaim disagreeing with this fundamental assumption of the Mishnah. So I don't see a way out of it. I hope that whoever has to deal with this question might find a way out of it.
Thank you, Rabbi Grossman.
Sure. Guess that's it. Okay, everybody.
No, I actually regarding the issue of when the baby is put to death before the woman is put to death, and because of the niwul that this would cause the woman, I was wondering whether there's a deeper possible understanding of that, and that is that the niwul is the actual, not just the fact that the sight of the baby being ejected afterwards, but the very reality of a baby from the moment it comes into the world not having a mother. Isn't that in and of itself a type of humiliation, like just a horrible fact, to a horrible reality that would also reflect in a way that would also essentially humiliate the woman?
I don't think that's how they understood it. They didn't look at it from the perspective. It says shalo tavo lidei niwul, so she doesn't come to the state of it. We're looking strictly at from the perspective of the shame of the woman. That's what we're trying to avoid. It doesn't talk about
Right.
protecting the child from being, let's say, an orphan born into this basically born an orphan and dead and then killed right away. That doesn't seem to be what they meant by niwul.
The other thing I was thinking is that maybe one way of framing this whole issue is that there's a balancing of different values here. Mm-hmm. And it could be that bloodshed is indeed horrible, and of any kind of bloodshed is a terrible thing, but it's the Torah that tells us when to balance even that heavy duty value against all sorts of other values. And it may just be that, at least based on some of the perspectives that you showed us tonight, that under certain circumstances, either the health or mental health of the woman could be considered a more important value in terms of counterbalancing, in other words, a stronger value under the circumstances as compared to the value of the bloodshed.
Yeah, there is room for that. That is part of the debate. I'd like to make mention, by the way. Hold on, we're still connected. You can still hear me. So my connection's
yes.
weak. Okay. So
yes.
Rabbi Moshe Feinstein took an interesting position. Let's get back to what I said, how this wouldn't have been a question if not for, let's say, modern medicine. They say this is a form of medical treatment, even though it involves, for a Gentile, it involves basically bloodshed. We could give arguments that are to the lenient side. But like I said, in the olden days, they basically didn't come up because we had no way to perform abortions in a way that was precise and would only terminate the pregnancy, but not bring real harm to the mother. That's something that's only exists in the 20th century and 21st century now. So it was almost not a question. The lenient position was very, very impractical. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein wrote, when he took his extreme opinion, which I think perhaps is justified, he said because nowadays, he lived in America where basically this became another form of birth control. The society basically said that what is basically bloodshed for a Gentile society became now broadcast as a right to choose and just another thing you do. So Rav Moshe Feinstein basically was making his lenient his strict ruling in an environment, in an atmosphere of permissiveness, and someone had to step in and say, you know what, even with all these considerations, yes, you could potentially help some women who would be scarred for life, or if they don't die from such a thing, and et cetera, and all these other considerations. Even with that, because this is such a terrible thing and it's becoming too permissive, we have to go to the opposite extreme, and we have to say that this is prohibited at most costs. Not exactly. Rav Moshe Feinstein still gives like the explicit cases of the Talmud allowing for such a thing, but he limited it to that. It says only in the case where, like where Maimonides brought, basically the Gemara, the woman who's having trouble giving birth and she could die from it. But and there's a good reason, because we have a slippery slope here. If even if we have a standard that fits, let's say, that of the most permissive Israeli poskim, eventually we might become way too permissive. Like any woman who just like, oh, I can't handle the baby, oh, I'm going to have a psychological problem. In the olden days, Chazal would have said, you live with the consequences of your actions. The vast majority of women who end up pregnant and start considering an abortion are not victims of rape. So you don't want to have to this. Everybody's giving their own abortion for their own reasons. We have to be very careful, and that's why I think, with regards to many other things, these decisions, if chas v'shalom an abortion has to be considered, should be made, of course, not by the woman, not by her doctor. She can petition for one, but by a Beit Din. Beit Din should allow such a thing, just like we go to Beit Din for other things. You need someone who's objective and knows the halachot and knows all the considerations. You need a bunch of people to make. You can't even decide with one person. You should have a Beit Din of at least 3 who know what they're doing in order to decide such a thing. But once again, the laws don't provide for such a thing. The laws are not talking about such a thing. So we have to pray that, once again, whoever's making the laws, that's us, make sure to do it in the spirit of halacha, whether for Jew or for Gentile. I'm horrified by these considerations myself. You say, oh, what if she's this? I don't know. Thank God I'm not going to be in that position. I'm a man, thank God. I say, thank God I'm a man every day, because women get put into positions that are a lot more consequential. Yeah. Any more questions there?
There's Elizabeth Flores just further commented on the answer you gave to her question by saying, thank you. So within Israel, we will have one law for all of us, the Gentile and us, and follow our law. We will all follow regarding abortion. In parentheses, she said, sounds like okay for the health of the woman, health, hopefully including total health, mental and physical, end of parentheses.
Yes, we do want to keep women's health. That is a priority. Every person's health is a priority. We can't put people aside. Yeah.
I was also thinking that in the spirit of what you were saying, that Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal was saying, that it could be, I'll just throw this out there, it could be that under the totality of the circumstances in America, in terms of the direction it's taken, it could be that the total net effect of the reversal of Roe v. Wade could be a net positive effect, even if there would be some problems around the edges. By the way, my understanding is that almost every state would allow for abortions if the mother's life was at risk. I don't know about all of the other kulot and heterim, but regarding that, I believe that almost every state would allow that.
You see, the OU put out a response, the OU, or Union of Orthodox, the Orthodox Union in America, basically saying we can't applaud this, we're not happy, we're not sad about it, because none of this is in line with the Torah. The Torah has a very nuanced approach to this. Our poskim have a very nuanced approach that is not just reduced to right to choose or pro-life or whatever, forbidden or permitted. What are you going to do? We're really stuck. But I do think, thank God, that they say the benefits is, if the federal government gets out of this, at least the states will have some say. But then again, the states, what do we know about their legislative processes? Are those in consonance with the Torah? I don't know. I think I would imagine some states do a better job than others. And a person, at least if he's not moving to Eretz Yisrael, he should at least live in a state where it's decent, and they at least approach some form of halacha that could be considered halacha for Noahides.
Oh, Rabbi Grossman, there's one thing I would be remiss if I didn't say, which I think you would agree with. or at least you do agree with the spirit of it, which is that along the lines of what you were saying, that if you're living in a crazy society with crazy values, well, get out of there. Well, so I think there's two arguments we can make. First of all, if you live in a place like New York or LA, maybe you should be moving to a state which has better values. And of course, ultimately, there's a much better question, which is, why would you want to stay in a country like that when you could go to another country, which is called Eretz Yisrael, where you're fulfilling a mitzvah? So in other words, there's even more of a reason to come to Israel nowadays because of all the positive reasons to come to Israel regarding the commandments. And also because why do you want to stay in a crazy place?
Yeah, I tell you people all the time, you move here at least for whatever problems we have, which I will not discuss. I will never say anything bad. You can't say anything about Eretz Yisrael or its society or its state because that's from Lashon Hara. Whatever there may be here, it's still better. Despite everything, it's still better than anywhere else in the world. And that's why God intended for us to be here. And you should be here. And the more Jews we have here, the more good Jews we have here, Jews who are loyal to the Torah, the more our society as a whole and our state and our government and our laws will approximate those of the Torah. And now I have to sign off. So I'm sorry if you have any more, just people can send me. We could address this some other time, but I myself have to go. So I wish everybody health. May you all have many children, happy Jewish families here in the land of Israel, and not have to ever deal with these halachot in a practical manner.
Thank you very much Thank you very much, Rabbi Grossman, for giving us of your time.
Sure, be good.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.